On one of your takeoffs, you blew a tire. You knew you would have to do a crash landing, but you went ahead with the mission anyway.
Yes, that was about, I'd say maybe the 12th or 13th mission. It was fairly early, certainly in the first third of my missions. I opened the throttles wide open, and we roared down the runway. We got about halfway down, and the right tire blew. Just two major wheels on a B-24 barn. Then you have the little nose wheel, which is used in taxiing. I didn't know what to do, whether to try to jam on the brakes. All this, keep in mind, this decision is made in a split second, but you still have time to think, shall I hit the brakes or shall I keep the throttles open and pull this plane off the ground? I decided we couldn't stop with one tire blowing, that if I hit the brakes, it would lurch to that side to the point where we'd tear off a wing and maybe explode. So I just kept the throttles wide open. I had to correct for the drag on that wheel by advancing the throttles a little more on that side and cutting the power a little bit on the left side. We got to the end of the runway. We weren't quite at takeoff speed. I pulled it off anyway. And I don't know how far we flew before we started to gain altitude. And slowly but surely, I could see the treetops, looked like they were going to hit the undercarriage. We began to climb, and I knew we were in the clear. Then the question is, what do you do with a wheel off on one side? How are you going to land? So I called the tower and asked for instructions. And they said, well, Lieutenant, it's up to you. You can turn around and make a landing on one wheel. We wouldn't advise that. You're loaded with bombs, you're loaded with gasoline. You can go on the mission, burn up most of your gasoline, drop your bombs, and then come back, and you can make a decision then whether to bail out or try to land on one wheel. I decided to try to land on one wheel. I told the crew, I said, any of you guys want to bail out, it's fine. There won't be any admonition from me one way or the other. And they said, well, what are you going to do? I said, well, I'm going to take this plane in. All 9 of them said, we're going to go with you. You know, this has to be a certain amount of luck. It was the best landing I ever made in my life. I set that plane down with such ease. It just, you could hardly hear the wheel hit the ground, just sort of a little swishing sound. And that plane just floated to a start. I had again advanced the engines on the right side to compensate for the drag, and then as the bomber slowed, I gradually took the power off. I never made a better landing in World War II. It was one of the reasons I was put in for the Distinguished Flying Cross, although I got that later for another landing that I made on the Isle of Viz.
There's nothing that they can do to train you for something like that. That is the ultimate test, really.
The only thing they train you for is if you lose an engine on one side, they train you how to advance the throttle so you compensate for the engine drag on the side that's dead, but or the engine that's dead. But I never had any training in what to do if a wheel comes off or you blow a tire, which is almost the same thing.
As you get closer and closer to that 35th mission, that golden 35th mission, do you start getting superstitious? Do you handle things differently? Do you play it safe? What do you do?
You just have to treat it like any other mission. Obviously, if you had some way of knowing you'd go down on the 35th mission, you'd figure out some reason not to go. Pilots never had to fly a mission. They could absolutely say, I am not flying today, and they'd give you an excuse. You probably also got a black mark on your record, but I never was tempted once not to fly a mission when it was my turn to fly. So I think by then we had the momentum going. We knew the United States was going to win the war, and I didn't feel any special fear about that 35th mission. I have to tell you, it was probably the worst mission of the war for us. That was the one where we got over 100 holes torn in the fuselage of that big airplane. We came back without any brakes. The hydraulic system was shot out. We had no flaps to slow the landing speed. We couldn't put the gear down automatically. We had to crank it down laboriously by hand. And then we had this riddled old tub that we somehow had to keep together until we got to the landing field.
After you completed...
By the way, I also on that last mission had a man hit with a piece of shrapnel. It entered just below his knee and followed all the way up to his leg, to his buttocks. And he was badly hurt. Tex Ashlock, a big 6'2" gunner in the back of the airplane. Sadly enough, we had to leave him in Italy. He couldn't leave the hospital when the rest of us came back to the States. I remember him crying, this great big Texan. I remember him crying when I reached over and gave him a hug. I almost was tempted not to go home and to stay with him until he got out of the hospital. But my wife had given birth to a little child I had never seen. She was then several months old, and that swung me in the direction of saying goodbye to Tex. And of course, he arrived a month or so after the rest of us.
That's the bond that you develop with the crew, that you would consider staying around until he was ready to go?
Oh, absolutely. I loved every member of that crew, and just as they loved me. That's the only word I can use. There was also a great feeling of dependence that we had on each other. But yes, we were bonded. We were 10 men who knew our lives depended on teamwork and on the proficiency of the other members of the crew. I had a great co-pilot. He wanted to be a fighter pilot in the worst way, but he wasn't allowed to be that, and he became my co-pilot. He was a brilliant flyer, and thank God for that. He could sometimes, when we were on formation, take over for a while and give me a rest, and he'd hold that airplane in there in tight formation just as well as I could.
Excuse me. In 1972, when you ran for president, most Americans were not aware of your war record, and that was pretty much a decision that you made not to publicize that, wasn't it?
I found it awkward, frankly, to talk about my war record. It almost seemed like boasting. And I thought, well, most people that are interested probably know that I was a combat pilot. It isn't that I was totally silent about it. I once in a while would tell an audience about bringing a plane home on a difficult mission. But I never made a big thing in paid advertising about what a great war hero I was. It wasn't until Professor Ambrose got hold of me 50 years after the war and wrote that great book, The Wild Blue, and he got me talking about the war where I was relating things I thought I had forgotten. He was a brilliant interrogator, and he got the whole story there in that book he wrote, a best-selling book. And since then, I've found it rather easy to talk to people about World War II. I think at long last I'm free of some of the unhappy memories. I still mourn all the pilots that went down, the crews, the people that were lost. Yes, I still mourn them. I still am very cautious about committing young men to warfare unless it's absolutely necessary in the national interest of this great country that we all love. Don't send young men to die unless you know what you're doing.
Would you have had the same perspective if you did not have that military background?
I think the military background has given me a greater measure of caution about committing youngsters to battle than I otherwise would have had. When I hear these people beating on their chests saying, support our troops, the best way to support our troops is not to send them into unnecessary danger, into unnecessary wars. Of course we support our troops. Have you ever seen some Americans stand up saying, I don't support our troops? But if you really support America's young men, don't be careless about committing them to unnecessary death and unnecessary warfare.
Was World War II the last moral war that we've been in, do you think?
World War II was the last war that I was absolutely certain about. Uh, Korea, probably second in line. We never should have gone into Vietnam. A disastrous mistake, and I knew that almost from the first year we were involved there as a brand new senator. I think that we have fought conflicts since then. I question the necessity of invading Iraq. We haven't yet found the weapons of mass destruction, but in any event, I didn't think that was an essential war. I'm glad we prevailed, but I thought it was not essential to the American national interest. You know, the old English conservative Edmund Burke, when he was a member of Parliament, he said, a conscientious man will be cautious how he deals in blood. That's what I think. We want to be very cautious about committing our grandsons, young men of this country, or young women, to a conflict unless it's absolutely in the national interest of the United States.
But it would be a mistake to think of you as a pacifist.
Oh, I'm not a pacifist. If we had a challenge like we did with Hitler and the Japanese in World War II, I'd volunteer again if I had the strength to do it. I guess they wouldn't take me at the age of 80, but my impulse would be there. Any time the survival of the American people in our democracy is on the line, I'm ready to use force to protect this country. But I'm also ready to be cautious and know deep in my soul that this is a war we have to fight in the security and national interest of the United States before I'll sacrifice one young American life.
When you look back on it, do you think to yourself how incredible it is what your generation, what you and your crew and all your colleagues were able to do at such an incredibly young age?
I do indeed. In retrospect, I don't know how so many millions of young Americans laid their lives on the line, both in the air, on the ground, and at sea, and pulled it off. We won a war against an enemy that was much better equipped at the beginning of the war than we were, and we came from behind and defeated the Axis powers and did it fair and square. I think it was an enormous achievement. Probably the Great Depression and World War II were the forges in which that generation was hardened like steel for the struggles that faced us.
Is that old expression that doesn't kill you makes you stronger? Do you believe that?
I do believe that. I think that meeting a difficult test, not yielding, does make you stronger, both in meeting, for example, the Great Depression of the 20s and 30s and meeting the test of war in the 1940s. I think it made our generation stronger than we otherwise would have been.
If we were to face a Hitler today, do you think we would have the same resolve?
I think we still have young people who are capable of meeting that kind of a challenge. I've always had faith in the young people of America. They may be different than our generation. They've probably had it easier growing up. On the other hand, they've had some temptations and difficulties to overcome that we didn't have so much of 50 years ago. We didn't have the drug problem in this country. We didn't have the degree of alcoholism when we were coming through. We didn't have the danger of too much affluence. I remember somebody writing an article, the difficulty of growing up rich. You know, there's some hazards that go with that. We didn't have to worry about being too rich or having it too easy, and in that sense, those difficulties were almost an advantage to us.
Several years ago, you had a daughter who you love very much who died from alcoholism, and you wrote a book about it and you went public with it. Why did you do that, sir?
That was the saddest chapter of my life by far. Terry McGovern was a wonderful young woman, a delightful, intelligent, humane, compassionate, witty person. She could crack me up, drunk or sober, when she was in those conditions. But she was an alcoholic. She was terribly addicted to alcohol. She fought that all of her adult life, in and out of programs, in and out of the AA, counselors, reading the Bible, reading the books of Eastern wisdom, all those things. She fought that malady tooth and nail. In the end, after she got out of the treatment centers, one night she had sworn, never again will I take a drink. This is it. I've got 2 wonderful little girls. I'm never again. That night, a Vietnam veteran who was a friend of hers said, Terry, let's have one Christmas toast before you go off to join your parents in Washington, D.C. Let's just have one. 3 hours later, when the bartender refused to serve her any longer, she wandered out into a Wisconsin snowstorm, stumbled about a half a block, fell into a alleyway, and froze to death. They found her body the next day about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, frozen hard. It's the worst thing that can happen to you in life, to lose one of your kids, and it doesn't make any difference whether they're 5 years old or 45. In fact, the longer they've been around, the more shared history, the more memories, the more laughs, the more tears you recall. It was terrible. And I'm frank to say it just about did me in, more than flying 35 combat missions in World War II. I wrote a book about it because I didn't want this death to be in vain. I didn't want her life to be in vain. I wanted to tell people what a wonderful person she was, and yet how that addiction, which is a medical illness of the first rank, how it killed her, and the danger to other young people. I worry about binge drinking on the part of young people these days, on the campuses and elsewhere. Not that they're all alcoholics. I'm not a teetotaler myself, but I worry about excessive drinking that can take you over the line into alcoholism. I think heredity has a lot to do with this. That's why I wrote that book. I'm glad that I did. I have always hoped that in God's good time that someday I'll learn why Terry died. I think I know the reasons. I think she was overcome by a malady she couldn't surpass. That test to her was more difficult than overcoming German anti-aircraft fire in World War II. And she went down.
So courage comes in many different forms?
Courage comes in many different forms. It certainly does. It took a lot of courage for me as a freshman senator to stand up on the floor of the United States Senate in 1963. I'd only been in the Senate about 8 months, and to make my first speech warning against our deepening involvement in Vietnam. President Kennedy, my dear friend, was then President of the United States. But I thought we were on the wrong course. I continued my criticism in the Johnson administration. I continued it for 4 years in the Nixon administration. So it didn't make any difference to me whether presidents were Democrats or Republicans. I felt that war was mistaken and that we were needlessly sacrificing brave young Americans in a war we never should have entered. I felt that way then. I feel that way today.
If you saw that 7th grade gym teacher now, what would you tell him about courage?
I would tell that 7th grade gym teacher never to tell a youngster, particularly in front of his classmates, that he's a coward. I knew deep in my soul I wasn't a coward, but I also knew that I'd been humiliated by a man we all admired. I heard Joe say some other things later in life that I thought were ill-advised, too much harsh profanity, cursing out football players, basketball players. I don't hold that against him. I just think that it showed a certain amount of immaturity on his part.
How would you like to be remembered?
I'd like to be remembered as a man who did everything he could to serve America, both in time of war and in time of peace. Not as a man free of mistakes, but a man who did his best as he saw it to serve this country.
Thank you very much, sir.